What is systemic racism? Dr. Hernandez described it as the patterns of discrimination and inequitable treatment based on race that are built into social and institutional structures. We can break that down even further by stating that our society was designed to limit the power, privilege, and advantage of non-white racial and ethnic groups. A great way you could impart this information to others would be through history. We've all heard the term that history repeats itself, or as Dr. Hernandez says, the past informs the present. Throughout history, we've seen countless times racial and ethnic groups that are not white be treated unfairly and unjustly. The first example of this would be white Americans' views on Asians and how for more than 80 years, Americans viewed Asians as economic threats. My second example would be how in World War II, the internment camps or isolated areas that were not safe, healthy, or livable, where Americans forced Asians to live as they thought they were spies. Or a third example that we learned in our course media being that in 1920, the U.S. Supreme Court denied Asian citizenship on the basis that they could not assimilate. These past experiences of historical racism have impacted Asians modernly today by limiting job opportunities, creating financial insecurity, and placing limits on immigration and overall impacting the well-being of this racial and ethnic group. And however, this is just one racial group that has been impacted by the racial white frame, or the idea that whiteness is normal, natural, right, or good. The topics or stories that I would prioritize would be the Asian internment camps and their modern-day impact on Asians in America today. Growing up in a conservative, primarily white, upper-class town, our school system would try to hide anything that made Americans seem imperfect. One of those topics was the Asian internment camps that started on February 19th, 1942 and lasted until March 20th, 1946. We briefly discussed this topic in my U.S. history class during my first year of high school. However, we never went into depth about what happened or why it did. It would not be until my sophomore year of high school that I learned about the horrors of what went on in these camps at the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam. I think it's essential to see how the horrors that happened at this camp were a leading cause of the model minority trope, a way that America tried to hide the horrors that came from this camp by replacing them with a compliment like Asians are smart, which is a microaggression or indirect discrimination against a marginalized group. We saw a direct example of this within our course media, where a poet submitted 40 literary magazines under his name and then to other publications under a fake name, and saw that his poetry would have more publicity under his fake name, which is primarily due to the microaggression that Asians are smart. We can see how these internment camps have directly impacted the microaggressions that are commonly used today. We can see how the internment camps cause physical, psychological, and increased cardiovascular disease, which still impacts Asian Americans today. However, classrooms across America often partially or wholly leave out this vital part of history. Within the first few weeks of school, we learned that there is no credible evidence of learning styles. However, there is credible evidence of the benefit of repetition in understanding and grasping a concept, so reading, watching, and listening to specific articles and videos would allow for significant repetition, which could aid in students' understanding of a specific topic. A great medium to use to discuss any subject that stirs up friction could be through personal stories. Personal stories are a great medium to engage your audience, and a great way of doing this is through guest speakers who have lived through this experience and have had first-hand experience on this topic. Research has shown that it can be tricky to understand the subject at hand if you have no connection with a specific topic. Going off my example of Asian internment camps, there are still survivors alive today who have real stories of their times within these camps. Their knowledge would be a great learning tool for students who have not faced this type of prejudice and discrimination, as not everyone experiences prejudice and discrimination the same. Generational gaps, or the differences or outlooks on different generations, can provide wisdom and tension regarding specific topics that may cause friction within certain groups. Dr. Hernandez stated, to adjust our mentality, we need to work on empathy. With that being said, I would leave my presentation style with empathy and the importance of it. We learned about the importance of empathy within our course media of how Christian was able to connect with a young black male because his mother had been diagnosed with breast cancer. There are lots of differences between Gen Z and Generation X+. However, one of the main differences I can think of would be the attention span. Due to social media platforms like TikTok, research has found that on average, Gen Z has shorter attention spans than the older generations. So instead of focusing on ways to entertain and keep attention span, my teaching method would alter by focusing less on trying to keep attention spans within the two age groups. However, one thing I would keep would be the varying ways or mediums in which I present my information through the use of videos, reading material, and guest speakers, as repetition has been found to help the human brain, regardless of age, to be able to help and understand the specific topic.
Hi, my name is Sophia Medina. I am a mixed race Christian woman. And who do we have over here?
My name is Ashley. I'm a white, straight, female Christian.
Hi, I'm Taylor. I'm a white, straight, female, able-bodied Christian.
Alrighty, what do you think is the most difficult thing for the majority of people in this country to understand about race and racism?
I think it's difficult for people to see that it's real and it's still going on, and it can't always be seen by an outsider.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's difficult for people to understand the idea of like systemic racism, where there's roots somewhere else where it's not blatant and in your face.
Yeah, good. How were your thoughts and beliefs about race and racism formed?
I would say they were formed by my family and my parents for the first few years, and then as I talked to my friends and saw social media, they kind of changed a little.
I think that social media had a lot to do with the way that I view race and racism. Like TikTok, I've learned a lot through that, and just through like basically the opinions of other people.
Yeah. What's one race-based topic that you wish more people talked about or understood?
I would say institutional racism, like criminal justice and not getting the right representative, especially for minority.
I think people should understand that microaggressions and like small forms of racism are still racism, and that still needs to change.
Okay, thanks.
Alright, guys.
I wanted to add a segment to briefly discuss my interviewees' responses to the questions I asked them and how they tie into my personal interview questions, even though the questions are not the same. I found it interesting how both my interviewees discussed the topic of not being able to see the water and how they believe that people often forget that racism does not have to be quote unquote in your face, but the reality that systemic racism is a real problem that impacts people in modern times. This relates to my example of how Asian internment camps back in the 1940s still have significant impact on the mental and physical health of Asians today. We saw a direct example of this with another minority group within our course media, quoting, "The reasons the black population had higher rates of death and illness," he said, "was because of occupational hazards and poverty and less access to health care," which is another example of how systemic racism is just as significant issue as individual racism. I also found it interesting and wanted to comment on how both of my interviewees said social media played a significant role in where their beliefs about racism came from. This ties into my comment earlier about generational gaps and how generations use different platforms and methods to understand specific topics, and why there is an importance in changing teaching methods or the way you discuss specific topics within generations. Lastly, I found it interesting how my interviewees discussed how criminal justice was not represented in relatively in certain minority groups, and how microaggressions or small forms of racism are still racism. This was interesting to hear and relate to the example of Asian internment camps, how the U.S. was criminally unjust towards that minority group, and the microaggressions that formed from that horrific event.